Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kaustri. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Well, this week we're diving into on analysis, #diplomacy. But first, of course, the ASEAN Summit took center stage through this week across Kuala Lumpur, with Malaysia taking cruise control as ASEAN chair in 2025. Now, with all things tariffs, trade disruptions and shrinking growth forecasts being in sharp focus, Niaga Spotlight delves into the timely topic of #diplomacy, US tweets and ASEAN shifts. So we examine a powerful and surprising layer of American policy making, one that's not found in official legislation or closed-door committees, but rather in retweets, hashtags and quote posts. Yes, we're talking about Congress's digital battleground. Now, according to the latest Spheres of Influence report from Penta, one of Washington's top public affairs firms, the way lawmakers are using X, formerly Twitter, has evolved into a sophisticated, often polarized tool of political influence. Now, this is more than messaging. It's momentum building, base activation, and even agenda setting. Why should this matter to business leaders and policymakers in Malaysia and across ASEAN? Because what trends on Capitol Hill's feeds today may become trade policy, tech restrictions, or even ESG mandates tomorrow. Now, understanding how influence is built and battles are fought in Washington's digital trenches is critical for anticipating policy shifts as well as protecting regional business interests. Joining us to unpack this is someone at the center of it all, Brian DeAngelis, partner and head of Penta Group's Washington, D.C. office. A former U.S. Senate strategist and leading voice in media and public affairs, Brian helps Fortune 500 companies and global leaders interpret and shape U.S. policy narratives. Brian, welcome to Niaga Spotlight. Thank you very much for making time. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. So let's dive right in, Brian. Now, your report, of course, reveals that Republicans and Democrats are using X, formerly Twitter, in increasingly divergent ways. How are these digital strategies signaling not only partisan divides, but actually pretty fundamental approaches to governing from Penta's research and work?
Yeah, we're seeing both parties use the power of social media to, as you said in the intro, really galvanize their base. In the Republican side, you're seeing it as a way to connect their support, to show they're in line with President Trump's message. They know that's an important platform and channel that he pays attention to. And on the Democratic side, you saw back in our Q4 report, really Democrats start to move away from X. It was a little bit of a protest of Elon Musk's influence in the White House and with President Trump. But they came back very strong in Q1 because they understand that is where news is breaking. That is where their base and Americans are going to get information. And they know they can tap into the power of social media in the sense of the anger, the frustration, the viralness of the content to really start to build their support, both legislatively, but also back on the campaign trail, whether that's small dollar donations or just starting to build up the grassroots support.
Exactly. Now, I think it's really interesting how Penta's research and also just as a journalist who's also a user of X, you can actually notice the downtrend of Democrats' presence on Twitter versus Republican policymakers, right? So it's super interesting that this partisan messaging divergence is coming out quite clearly. Now let's shift into what this might mean and what lessons perhaps ASEAN executives might take away from all this which is happening online in real time.
Well, it's another proof point of how democratized American politics has become. It's really become a new almost sport for Americans. They do follow it. They do get excited or frustrated, but either way, they bring a lot of energy to these debates. And it's platforms like Twitter that produce that bite-sized information that they can get at any point on their phone, as opposed to traditional media where you're sitting through reading the article or listening to the podcast or watching the cable news show. So folks know that's where they can go. And that is where corporations from ASEAN nations, or even a lot of what we advise in the United States, you can tap into that same energy, both for your own intelligence of what's happening what's moving way before it hits, the newspapers, if you will. Or you can start to put your own message into that conversation and make sure both Americans and then the politicians that are chasing the same conversations online see your positions, understand where you stand on some of these topics.
Exactly. And of course, the research is also showing that clearly both Republicans as well as Democrats, they're sticking very much to what their party narratives are. Republicans, for example, really have been focusing on topics like immigration and crypto when it comes to what they're doing on X. Democrats, meanwhile, what they're saying on X primarily concerns healthcare, tariffs. And are you seeing that, given that the platform itself is primarily looking at X itself, Brian, what about the disinformation and that quite often blows out maybe the proportionality of the importance of the topics being discussed versus also all the disinformation in the mix because of the way in which the algorithm has changed and so many other shifts governance-wise for X?
Yeah, there's two ways to look at the power or influence of a platform like X. You understand it through the legislative and what I'll call the DC politics of it, which is the minute by minute update on where information is flowing, who's up, who's down, where a piece of legislation. We just saw this in the last week on our big domestic policy bill that went through the House of Representatives, that real-time information of how things are breaking down, a tremendous amount of influence. What a lot of folks need to be careful of is not to get lost in that when it comes to campaigning and understanding that side. Yes, it helps a lot with the base, but there are millions of Americans that are working every day, that are focused on their families and their lives. They're not checking X for the minute by minute update. They're not as plugged into it. So we often refer to it as the Washington bubble, but you can get sucked into the X bubble as well and really misunderstand what some of the rest of the country might be feeling on these issues.
Absolutely, and I think we echo with that very deeply here across ASEAN and even in Malaysia, where, for example, in Malaysia, we might refer to it as perhaps the Putrajaya bubble or even just generally the X or even the Facebook bubble, right? Okay, so digging deeper and moving on, Brian. Now, one of the most surprising findings that came out of your Spheres of Influence report is the emergence of unconventional influencers shaping congressional discourse online. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, we've been watching this trend for in many ways, probably the better part of a couple of years, but really acutely over the past election. Americans just consume information differently. And that's not to put anything against, traditional media or the power of still, your New York Times, your Financial Times, your Wall Street Journal, or even some of the cable news programs we see, but people live online. They are living in their communities. So we're seeing more and more these influencers, these individuals, whether that be journalists or podcast hosts or activists, really start to build communities around themselves and be able to drive messaging and policy decisions or the momentum behind those decisions in a way we really haven't seen before with traditional media. Many ways they're not bound by the rules of traditional media. So they're pushing opinion, they're pushing a point of view. They don't feel obligated to be two-sided, of course. And that's where we are starting to see them really come to the top of the list of what members of Congress are following, who they're engaging with. It's those same influencers.
Exactly. And of course, digital influencers can then move on into actually perhaps even shaping policy discourse when it comes to not just the kind of conversation that is generated, but perhaps zooming into the ASEAN and Southeast Asian landscape. Brian, do you feel there could be an opportunity here for Southeast Asian stakeholders then to engage with American policy indirectly, perhaps through media or even advocacy partnerships from what you're seeing?
I do. I think there's opportunity. I mean, the first is almost an obligation to understand how the American media environment and information environment is changing. And if you're not staying up to date, up to speed on where those changes are happening, you can find yourself running a playbook that's been out of date now for a couple of years. So I think there's first that almost, duty and responsibility to have the right intelligence, and then understanding where you can engage. We often call it the white space, but where is there a spot in this conversation where either as a country, as a partnership, as a region, or maybe as an individual company, you can insert your voice in a credible, authentic way, knowing through the intelligence that you will receive some appropriate amount of support and engagement from those audiences.
Absolutely. I think it's something which has shifted in the landscape, perhaps most distinctly in just the past 6 months alone. So clearly a lot more attention needs to be paid. Now, the Penta's report, Brian, also outlines top issues which are dominating American lawmakers' online messaging. So from your vantage point, which of these issues would it perhaps be? Maybe tech regulation, China policy, or energy transition? Which of these might actually end up having the most downstream impact on ASEAN economies?
In some ways, I want to choose all of the above, but I do think everything kind of starts and ends with China policy. I mean, it is an incredible priority and focus for President Trump. We've seen that he can have what in my opinion is a very rash approach to how to negotiate on some of the things that may be a priority, not only for him, but even some in the Democratic Party. He takes a very, very aggressive negotiating stance, and that's going to have ripple effects both across the US economy, but also across the Southeast Asian economies. I think that creates both downside risk in terms of the connections to China and how the president views some of the partnerships within the region. It also creates, I hope, a lot of opportunity. And you have seen some talk over the past few weeks of essentially a new trans-Pacific partnership in some ways. I don't think this administration will call it that, but another attempt to create some sort of trade partnerships, stronger relationships for the US in the region that helps buffer what they see as China's power and influence.
Absolutely. Now, of course, American lawmakers have been intensifying their discussions, sectors which are really vital to ASEAN economy, semiconductors, critical minerals. And I think we await with bated breath once the 90-day tariff pause actually runs out and what's going to come at the end of that. At the same time, when we look at more key issues a little bit longer term, like energy transition and geopolitical dynamics, what are some opportunities for perhaps American policymakers to also stay ahead of the game? Because the truth of the matter is that China globally is actually one of the biggest investors when it comes to clean energy, particularly in the ASEAN and the wider South Asia region. So there is also a chance for America to get ahead of that, regardless of the current administration's perspectives, perhaps, towards energy transition.
That's right. It's critical, I think, for American policymakers, frankly, across both parties, to really understand the long-term implications of Trump's approach to not only foreign trade, but really foreign partnerships and foreign policy in general. My sense of this, and you've seen evidence of it, is we are by default empowering Europe and empowering Asia to start to think about themselves more as a bloc that has a lot of influence on the world, to not just rely on their relationships with the United States. That's going to have some lasting impact for the US in terms of how we engage with the world, how we think about trade partnerships, defense partnerships, as you said, energy and climate change partnerships. So there's opportunity there to really think about, as Europe or Southeast Asia and other regions start to stand up more, how can we do it in a way where we're still a partner, we're still working very closely with them, and avoiding maybe some of the adversarial damage that really could come out of the way Trump is approaching foreign policy.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your perspective so far, Brian. Most insightful. We take a short break now. We'll be right back with Niaga Spotlight. Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight, still with me, Tamina Kausji. And on today's show, we're discussing hashtag diplomacy, a look at Penta's Spheres of Influence report in deeper detail and connecting it back to trade headwinds, tariff talk, and everything happening in ASEAN and beyond, particularly in this crucial week as the ASEAN Summit wraps up in Kuala Lumpur. Brian, so getting back into the discussion. Now, looking at the fact that American politicians are so much more increasingly using social media, not just to communicate policy, but to also build ideological loyalty and fundraising pipelines. So does this point towards a blurring between governance and brand building?
Oh, absolutely. I think we've been on this trajectory for probably a number of years here, and you see it with what I call these viral stars. I mean, in many ways, it probably did start with President Trump. Maybe you could make an argument for Barack Obama, but you're watching as candidates from both the right, the Republican Party, but even the Alexandria or Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, as she's known here in the US, Bernie Sanders, they are tapping into movements first through social media and first through that constant updates of content and engagement and reaction to those items that they know are going to go viral online, that they know Americans are getting fired up about. And they're making a name for themselves. And it's not a separation in their mind of when am I campaigning, when am I acting as a member of the United States Congress. It's one and the same. It's building up these super brands that you've seen around some of these politicians, and that translates into both a big reputation among the base, but it also makes you kind of public enemy number one on the opposition side, because again, the viral nature of it. So we're seeing it. I think we'll see more of it, at least more attempts, and really those candidates that are able to do it well will rise to the top of some of the candidate lists.
Clearly, and perhaps at the same time, it may also be prioritizing personal or party branding over perhaps bipartisan governance. This could be some issues to look at, but I think a lot of the same is actually happening around not only ASEAN, but also within the Malaysian political sphere. But perhaps looking at the impact on the predictability for ASEAN stakeholders who are also observing all of this rollout in real time on American social media. Some thoughts on that, Brian?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult as things change so quickly. But to my earlier point, to stay ahead of these movements, to stay ahead of, really which member of Congress or members of Congress are the quote unquote rising stars at the moment, you have to have a good intelligence and operation kind of looking at channels like X, understanding those movements almost in real time, I would say, understanding both what is motivating that conversation too. A lot of what we look at Penta is not what the members of Congress are saying. This report obviously being the end of that research for us, but what are the influencers of that members of Congress saying? What are the influencers of those influencers saying? Where does this conversation start to bubble up? And are there opportunities to both monitor that and start to see around the corner of issues coming? And as I said before, for countries or regions to start to put their messaging out there earlier in the process before we have that viral moment with the member of Congress.
Clearly, and at the same time, of course, identifying what the pressure points might be for certain policy-related discussions. Brian, so then perhaps I'd love to get your insights on markets like Malaysia and across ASEAN, though. Digital strategy is still often quite seen as complementary to policy engagement. In contrast, clearly, Penta's research and reports are suggesting in Washington, digital positioning is now rather central to political leverage. Is this a trend that ASEAN government affairs teams should also begin mirroring?
I would hesitate to say begin mirroring. I do think this is a challenge for a lot of American politicians, because what they often find is the ability to go viral, to put that digital strategy first, to really build that base. And then as their careers advance within Congress, they find themselves truly in the positions of power, as if being a chair of a committee, for example, with a major piece of legislation. And then to something you said earlier, they have to start acting a little bipartisan to try to get the votes. They have to start to make deals and negotiate. And explaining why you made a deal and did something the way you did it to get votes doesn't quite translate into that viral moment on X. So folks find themselves kind of losing some of that momentum that they see on social media. There's certainly opportunities to get it back. This is why, in many ways, you often see the opposition party having a lot more success in moments like this. Part of what our report showed is that Democratic voice on tariffs really taking off, because we're not the ones in the position to go negotiate the deals. We're the ones that can kind of sit there and say, this is wrong, Trump's handling it the wrong way, look at the damage it's doing on Americans. And that's the type of content that takes off on platforms like X.
Absolutely. And at the same time, of course, it depends so much on public opinion. For example, if business owners, small shareholders in particular, are the ones to voice out how the tariffs may be directly impacting them, that perhaps, starts off a chain reaction of maybe even political influencers taking on the mandate. All right, Brian, so now you've also highlighted that unexpected voices are clearly punching above their weight in influencing congressional debate. Can you unpack the mechanics of that influence? And perhaps could a well-strategized ASEAN corporate or even a sovereign voice similarly enter the digital influence sphere to perhaps move towards shaping more U.S. policy narratives?
Yes, it's a bit of a formula as you start to unpack it in terms of volume of content. As I mentioned, sort of the aggressiveness of the content, you're not quite as restrained as maybe a member of Congress is or has traditionally been in terms of what you can say and the opinion you want to push out on it. It's many ways why the media is falling further down those influencer lists, especially online, because the media traditionally wants to bring that journalistic ethics of let's tell both sides of the story, let's get to the facts. That's not the exciting stuff that fuels a platform like X. So we're seeing these very aggressive, almost full-time posters get out there, tap into those heated conversations, put themselves out there as the expert on it or the agitator of it. And that attracts more and more followers, which in turn creates more viral moments and creates more followers. And you fall into this formulaic cycle that puts some names that we wouldn't have seen a year ago, even 6 months ago, at the top of the list of the people driving these debates.
It's a very interesting intersection of, cultural timing, meme fluency, as well as emotional charge. Yes. And that's exactly what makes a lot of these traditionally non-expert voices actually rise to the top of the list. It's absolutely fascinating. I think what we're moving towards is perhaps an era of evolving algorithmic diplomacy. Would you agree with that?
I would, and on top of that, to your last point, you're losing some of the substance and policy expertise through that process. The folks who used to have the influence had decades of experience on an issue. They understood both sides of the issue. And even if they had a strongly held belief on one side, they could figure out parts of the other side where they were willing to negotiate or find compromise. You don't have to do that online. You don't have to go deep on it. You don't have to really even understand the substance. You just have to understand what's going to make more people mad or excited or angry about it to get more followers and more attention.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I can see the opportunity for perhaps if a Southeast Asian, let's say a sovereign wealth fund or a tech conglomerate would take the opportunity to frame a policy message, perhaps as a values-based, shareable narrative. Things like this may actually have the potential to perhaps go viral in the online atmosphere that we've actually helped to foster of late. Perhaps one last area before we take our leave, Brian. Now, let's talk about the quiet power of what's not being said. So based on your data, which key economic or geopolitical issues impacting ASEAN are perhaps notably absent or underrepresented in the congressional digital discourse?
I actually was quite surprised, even though it's on our list, of the immigration debate. And in many ways, the immigration debate right now in the US is very focused on our own borders. But what's getting lost, or at least tied up in a couple of other debates, is that immigration, whether it's through colleges and universities or work visas or, diplomatic opportunities. We had the whole Doge moment with USAID, for example. We're losing a moment where that cultural exchange can happen, where in our sense, we're hopefully pulling some of the best and brightest from different countries to come to America to understand our culture, to work in our companies, maybe go to our universities, invent the next great product, and vice versa. The Americans that go over to Asia or Europe understand that part of the world, bring that back to their workplaces here or their government jobs. I think that's going to be a big issue to many of the things we talked about today in terms of the lasting ripple effects of what's happening right now. And it's not being talked about. Again, it's not probably really that ripe content for viral moments on X. But if you really dig under the surface on 3 or 4 of these issues that we are seeing picked up, that's a big factor that we're keeping an eye on as well.
Absolutely. I think we take for granted on the tail end of, 80 years of largely peaceful global relations, what that kind of brain circulation has actually meant for global economies, including, of course, America's and wider ASEAN. Brian, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so very much for your insights. We wish you all the best at Penta, and thanks again for joining us on Niaga Spotlight.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's all we have time for today on Niaga Spotlight. I'm Tamina Kausji signing off for now, and we'll see you again next week with more economic analysis and insights. Here's to a productive week ahead.